EBurnett, and out front tonight, the State Department tells CNN an official at the American consulate in Benghazi, Libya, has been killed. It appears to be the result of a day of violence against American diplomatic posts in the Middle East. Armed men stormed the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya tonight, setting it on fire after a protest against an American-produced movie that they say insults the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this comes just hours after Egyptian protesters scaled the walls of the American embassy in Cairo and tore down the American flag. The protesters tried to raise a black flag with the words, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." CNN's Jomana Karache is in Tripoli and has been in touch with eyewitnesses in Benghazi, and she joins me on the phone now. Ian Lee is in Cairo tonight with the latest on the situation there and what violence the video has provoked. I want to start with you, Jomana, though. What is the very latest that you have heard from on the ground in Benghazi?
Well, Aaron, we're hearing very little from the U.S. Embassy here, but according to eyewitnesses in Benghazi, there are reports of Libyan casualties as a result of these clashes that erupted as members of the militant group tried to storm the U.S. Embassy. We are hearing they succeeded and did storm the embassy. What happened was, according to eyewitnesses, that Libyan security forces were engaged in heavy clashes with members of this armed group that is Ansar al-Sharia. It's a radical militant group that's based in eastern Libya. They also fired rocket-propelled grenades at the U.S. consulate building. Libyan army troops were deployed. The roads to the consulate were blocked by military vehicles. Now, we have conflicting reports on what the situation is there right now. Libyan government official was telling CNN that the building was being secured by Libyan forces, but according to this eyewitness, members of the armed group had taken over the consulate building and were celebrating and looting the consulate. Libyans have issued condemnation. Libyan officials we have spoken to have done the same. But Aaron, there are also calls on some social media sites for more protests in Benghazi and here in Tripoli.
And Jomana, I want to get back to you in a moment, but let me bring in Ian Lee now. Ian, can you tell me what the latest is in Cairo, and what specifically was it about this movie that sparked this sudden and very violent these attacks on the U.S. diplomatic posts?
Well, Aaron, the situation right now at the U.S. Embassy is that the protesters are staging a sit-in. There are hundreds still out there milling around saying they're going to spend the night. There's calls for more protests tomorrow. But what is specifically offensive about this film is many things, actually, Aaron. There's numerous things that Muslims would find offensive. Namely, the movie calls the Prophet Muhammad gay. He calls him a womanizer, calls him a molester of children. Basically, all things that Muslims would find offensive are in this video. And this is what the protesters are saying is fueling their anger to go to the embassy and as we saw, a handful of them go into the embassy compound, tear down the American flag. And during this whole operation, the question is, where were the security forces? They had known about this. The embassy gave out a warning to its citizens earlier in the day. We've known that the security forces have known this protest was going to happen for a while, so why weren't they there? It just shows the poor state of the Egyptian security forces right now, that they're unable to protect an embassy from protesters. And this wasn't a large crowd according to Egyptian standards. There was roughly 1,000 people, much smaller than the protests we've seen in the past. So that's the question officials will have to answer now.
And how? I know that you had a chance. You've been there many times, and you had a chance to see today what was happening. Ian, I mean, how violent was it? How frightening was it? And what were the things that they were doing?
Well, the protesters, when I was there, were climbing around the embassy walls. They were chanting "Down with America." They were calling for a jihad. Many things against violent chants against the U.S. government and against that embassy. A lot of people are saying that they're going to continue this pressure against the U.S. Embassy because of this video. So it is a very tense situation there, and there are calls for protest tomorrow. So we may see another tense situation, Aaron.
And Jomana, when it gets to Libya, I mean, how did they find out what had happened in Cairo? I mean, how much coordination was there, as people say? Well, you know, will these attacks continue, or will this escalate? Not just in Libya and in Cairo, but perhaps in other places.
Well, social media here, Aaron, has been the way that most of calls for protest and this sort of news does circulate. And there were some postings on pages like Facebook earlier today that could have been the call for this protest that took place outside the consulate. The difficult thing with Libya is many of these groups are armed, Aaron, and it's going to be very difficult to control it like we saw this evening. One government official I spoke to said the Libyan government is unable to protect itself sometimes from armed groups and attacks like these. So how is it going to be able to protect embassies and foreign missions here in cases like this? And there has been an escalation. We have seen these armed radical groups targeting foreign interests, especially in the eastern city of Benghazi. The U.S. consulate building that was attacked this evening was also attacked by a bomb that was left outside back in June. There were no casualties in that attack, but there are vulnerabilities. There are concerns here, especially with no strong police and military to fight back any attackers at the U.S. Embassy or other missions here.
Ian, what about the Egyptian government's response? I mean, so many people were trying to figure out what sort of government this will be. Obviously, an Islamist government, the Muslim Brotherhood government. Have they come out and apologized, explained why there were no security forces or why it escalated as much as it did today?
Well, Aaron, this is a big black eye for the Egyptian government. Seeing an American flag being destroyed isn't going to go over well. And the Egyptian government was quick to respond. The foreign ministry came out and condemned the protesters for going into the embassy. They said that they were going to talk with the different ministries that are involved in securing the embassy to find out why the security forces weren't able to stop these protesters. And the Egyptian security forces are always around the U.S. Embassy. If you walk by there on a normal day, you'll have Army armored personnel carriers, you'll have riot troops ready. So the question is, why weren't they able just to deploy quickly if they're already stationed there? And the foreign ministry has said that they're going to work with these different ministries to find out the answers why they were slow in responding. Aaron?
Certainly a lot of answers needed and real questions as to whether this escalates or continues, as Ian and Jumana reported. Jumana Karache and Ian Lee, thanks to both of you joining us from Libya and Cairo tonight. The incidents in Cairo and Benghazi, just the latest examples of anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. But what do they mean for this country going forward? Phil Mudd is former deputy director of the CIA Counterterrorist Center, and he's out front tonight. Phil, when we talk about this today, I'll just go ahead and mention what feels like the elephant in the room. Obviously, today is September 11th, a very somber day in this country. These incidents happened in both Cairo and in Libya today. Both have been linked to the movie that allegedly mocks the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, as you just heard Ian say, it seems like what it did say was some pretty horrible things. But is it coincidence or intentional that these protests happened today on September 11th?
No, my guess is that this is coincidence. This looks to me more like what we saw with those cartoons a few years ago out of Denmark, where you had unrest across places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think the coincidence of the date is just that, coincidence. All
right, let me bring in Ed Hussein as well into this conversation, Senior Fellow of Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Ed, thanks for taking the time to be with us as well. What does this mean for the United States? I mean, obviously tension is high, but what is the significance of this happening in two places on the same day against the U.S.?
Well, I think I'm in agreement with Phil. This is not a coincidence. This is by design. But I think several things stand out. One, that the narrative that the Arab Spring was all led by liberal secularists and somehow the Middle East is now warm and friendly towards America and American ideals. That narrative no longer holds true, if it ever did.
Right.
There are people on the fringes who are able to impact the center of political debate with this kind of outrageous activity. And now, what they will turn around and say to you, the Prophet Muhammad is a red light, Islam is a red light, don't cross that. What they fail to understand is this is not the actions of the United States government. They can't distinguish between free citizens in a free country doing whatever they wish to please, and the government of the country, in this case the US, is irresponsible and innocent of anything that happens. But this is, this is part of the problem in the Middle East, that they can't distinguish between independent citizens and the role of the governments. That's part of the legacy of living under a dictatorship for so many years.
But Phil, I'm wondering, I mean, why were there, I mean, is this just disorganization or looking the other way because the American embassy was involved? I mean, why were there not more Egyptian security forces there to prevent them scaling the walls and burning the American flag?
My guess is that they have a plan to respond to this, but they're just not as efficient as we might expect in the West. I mean, as somebody mentioned earlier, you've had attacks on different embassies across Cairo over the past months. The security services have gone through great disarray since the change in government, so they might not have been prepared for this. I'm guessing it also happened very quickly.
Right. It seems certainly from what Ian was reporting that was the case. But Ed, what about what a lot of Americans may ask as a result of this, which is until America really understands who's in charge and what they stand for, given the question marks in Cairo, also in Libya, how does the U.S. go ahead giving $1.5 billion in aid every year to Egypt? Most of that is military aid.
I think one of the main important reasons here that the relations between the Egyptian government, the current government under Mohamed Morsi, and the White House and the State Department and the Congress is in good shape is partly to do with that aid. I don't think immediately the question of aid should be put on the table. It's a tiny proportion of the U.S. annual budget that goes out to Egypt. For that, we get returns, and those returns include, a peace treaty with Israel, better influence over the region, a president that's been friendly towards the U.S., potential trade deals. So for that billion, I think...
You really think we get all that from it? I mean, when they were attacking the Israeli embassy recently and now crowds attacking the American? I mean, we get goodwill from it?
Well, those are headlines, but the reality on the ground is the peace deal with Israel still stands, and the Morsi government has gone after terrorists in the Sinai. I mean, that's unprecedented. For an Islamist president to go after al-Qaeda terrorists in Egypt, I mean, that's worth something. I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater because a few extremists have burnt a flag. That's exactly what they want, and we should not succumb to that pressure from the fringes.
Phil, what direction is this going, though? When you see the headlines, and I understand, Ed, distinguishing between the two, obviously on the ground and in Cairo, as we've all experienced, there are plenty of wonderful moments as well. But where is this heading towards?
I think this is heading in a direction that's pretty simple to follow if you look at polling data. Look, like through the rest of the Middle East, you've got fewer than 20% of Egyptians who have a positive view of the United States. And just about 10% of them think that American cultural representation in a place like Cairo is a good thing. So in the midst of that backdrop, you throw a match on this tinderbox in the form of this video, and unsurprisingly, people who've seen the Abu Ghraib videos, they've seen reports that we burn Korans in Afghanistan, decide we don't like America, we're going to go storm the embassy. So over the long term, we've got a lot of space to make up in terms of people who don't think America represents what we think it represents.
Right. Until those people have jobs and livelihoods of their own, it's hard to break that cycle. Well, thanks so much to both of you. We appreciate it. And ahead, Bill Clinton is on the campaign trail tonight for president.